billionaire could silence Wall Street with a single call, but on a transatlantic flight, he couldn't silence his own baby's cries. And the one person who stepped forward to help was the last face anyone expected, a poor black teenager from Chicago. What happened next changed both of their lives forever. The wail tore through the cabin like a siren that wouldn't stop. It was the kind of sound that made nerves fray and tempers snap. Piercing cry that had already lasted longer than anyone thought possible. 3 hours into the transatlantic flight, and the tiny lungs of 6-month-old Olivia Reed showed no sign of surrender. In the plush cocoon of first class, every polished surface, every leather seat, every hushed conversation was drowned out by the relentless cries of a baby who refused to be soothed. Harrison Reed, a man who had stared down investors, crushed competitors, and negotiated billion-dollar mergers, sat powerless in his seat. His Italian silk suit clung damply to his back. A monogrammed handkerchief was already soaked from dabbing the sweat at his temples. His tie was loosened, his perfectly pressed shirt now wrinkled, as if the baby's screams had shaken his entire aura of control apart thread by thread. He bounced Olivia with a mechanical rhythm, one arm aching, his voice hoarse from whispering every lullaby he could remember. Nothing worked. The flight attendant's practiced smile cracked hours ago, replaced by the tight-lipped look of someone holding back open contempt. She leaned down, voice barely audible over the shrieks. "So we've had several complaints. Is there anything else you can try?" Harrison didn't answer at first, only shook his head with a desperation that seemed foreign on his normally impenetrable face. "I've tried everything," he rasped finally, his throat raw. Bottles, toys, walking the aisle. She won't stop. The cabin was no longer just uncomfortable, it was hostile. A businessman slammed his laptop shut, muttered a curse, and shoved noise-canceling headphones over his ears. An older woman 2 rows back clicked her tongue loud enough for half the cabin to hear, her muttering laced with judgment about parents who couldn't control their children. Another passenger waved down a flight attendant and hissed about filing a formal complaint with the airline if this went on any longer. The whispers and glares pressed on Harrison from all sides, invisible hands of accusation squeezing him tighter with every passing minute. He adjusted Olivia again, his arm trembling, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. The sound of her screams was no longer just a noise. It was a humiliation, a spotlight on his failure. He was a man who had built Reed Enterprises from a garage startup into a global empire, who dictated terms to governments and banks, who wielded power like a second skin. And yet here he was, helpless, his daughter's cries reducing him to something smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The aircraft itself seemed to groan under the weight of her voice, the recycled air thick with tension. Even the curtain that separated first class from economy could not muffle the storm. The attendants exchanged nervous glances as they paced the aisle, aware that the situation was spiraling into something combustible. Harrison pressed his forehead against the cool window for a moment, eyes closed. His hand cupping the back of Olivia's tiny head, he whispered her name again and again, his voice breaking. But she only screamed louder, her face blotchy and red, fists clenched as if fighting the entire world. Across the cabin, a man snapped, "Is this going to continue the entire flight?" A ripple of agreement followed, passengers shifting angrily in their seats. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating, like a boardroom right before a hostile takeover, except Harrison wasn't the one in control. He was the target. The once invincible billionaire sat there stripped of all authority, unable to silence 6 pounds of wailing defiance. That was the twist, the bitter irony hanging in the recycled air of the Boeing 787. A man who could control markets, who could bend entire industries to his will, could not calm his own daughter. The bathroom mirror in the Johnsons' cramped apartment caught the first pale light of dawn. Marcus Johnson stood there in his one good shirt, collar slightly frayed at the edges, trying to press it flat with his palms, as though sheer willpower could make it look new. His reflection stared back at him with eyes that held both determination and exhaustion, the kind that didn't belong on a 17-year-old's face. He whispered the words his coach drilled into him before every tournament, a mantra spoken like a prayer. "You got this." The sounds of the South Side were already alive outside the thin walls. Car horns, a distant siren, voices echoing in the alleyways, and the clatter of the L train carrying strangers off to work. Inside, the apartment hummed with another kind of tension, the fragile anticipation of a family daring to hope. On the small counter sat an envelope holding his passport, his boarding pass, and the official letter from the International Chess Federation. The letter was creased from being unfolded too many times, but the words still carried the weight of destiny, an invitation to London, a chance for scholarship that could change everything. The bathroom door creaked open and Gloria Johnson leaned in. She was still in her scrubs from the night shift at the nursing home, her eyes ringed with fatigue, but her pride cut through the exhaustion. "My champion," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She had called him that since the day he first beat her at checkers, and though her son towered over her now, the nickname carried all the warmth of her belief in him. Marcus smiled, though his stomach knotted tight. "It's just the qualifying rounds, Mom. Don't plan a parade yet." She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his shoulder, the way mothers do when there is nothing else left to fix. "That's what you said about the state championship and the nationals. And every time you proved yourself. Don't downplay what you've earned, Marcus. You belong there." From the living room came a small voice, high and insistent. "Marcus, your chess stuff is ready." 7-year-old Zoe stood proudly beside the coffee table, where she had arranged his travel chess set, notebook, and lucky pencil with the precision of a soldier preparing gear for battle. Her braids bounced as she looked up at him with wide eyes. "I set them out just like you taught me." He ruffled her hair gently, careful not to disturb her neat part. "Perfect, Zoe. Couldn't have done it without you." She beamed, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the dim room. She had no idea how much her presence steadied him. In her, he saw both responsibility and motivation, the reason he couldn't afford to fail. Gloria pressed a folded bill into his hand as he lifted his bag. "Taxi fare," she said firmly when he tried to protest. "No son of mine is taking the L to the airport for an international flight." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she needed that money more than he did, but her eyes held that no-nonsense look he knew better than to challenge. He pocketed the cash with a quiet nod. As they walked him down to the curb, the cool morning air wrapped around them. The taxi's headlights cut through the dawn haze, pulling to a stop in front of their building. Zoe clung to his arm. "Win for me," she whispered. He crouched down, hugged her close. "For you, for Mom, for all of us." She giggled and added, "And don't forget your magic touch." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Magic touch? When I was a baby and I wouldn't stop crying, only you could calm me down. Mom said you had magic hands." Her voice was proud, as if it was some secret superpower. Gloria chuckled softly, though her eyes shimmered. "It's true, you were the only one who could get her to sleep. Patience, rhythm, and that humming of yours." Marcus smiled faintly, brushing it off. "That was just practice. You spend enough nights with a screaming baby, you figure things out." He didn't know it then, but the very skill his sister was teasing him about would become the unexpected bridge between worlds that didn't mix. The driver loaded his single-worn duffel into the trunk, eyeing the Johnsons with the detached politeness of someone used to hurried goodbyes. Gloria cupped her son's face one last time. "Remember, Marcus, no matter how they look at you, no matter what they expect, you earned your place at that board. Don't let anyone take that from you." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. As the taxi pulled away, he looked back at the third-floor window, where his mother and sister waved from behind the glass. Their silhouettes grew smaller until they blurred into the gray morning. Inside the cab, Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass, feeling the weight of their faith pressing down on him heavier than any luggage. Thought of the path ahead, 12 hours in the air, the grand halls of London, opponents who had trained with private coaches and endless resources. And then he thought of Zoe's words, magic touch. He had laughed at it then, but a part of him carried it like a secret token. On the chessboard, he relied on patterns, logic, and memory. But off the board, maybe he carried something else entirely. Something that couldn't be measured in rating points or grandmaster titles. Something that would, before long, change everything. The skyline of Chicago glittered outside the floor-ceiling windows of Harrison Reed's penthouse, the city laid out like a board of endless opportunities, each skyscraper another piece he had already conquered. At 45, he commanded empires with the click of a mouse, and this morning was no different. He sat in his leather chair, crisp shirt gleaming under the warm glow of recessed lights, eyes fixed on the screen where executives from Tokyo nodded as the final details of an acquisition fell into place. "Sign it," Harrison said, his voice even carrying the weight of authority that brokered billions without hesitation. His assistant, Vivian, stood nearby, tablet in hand, posture straight as a soldier. "Your itinerary is updated, sir. The jet is fueled and ready." He didn't look up. "And Olivia?" the nanny called out. "Family emergency." Harrison pinched the bridge of his nose, irritation flashing across his sharp features. He had meetings lined up in Paris, Catherine already there ahead of him, and now, of all mornings, he would be forced to manage his daughter alone. "Find another," he said flatly. Vivian shook her head. "None available on such short notice." A beat of silence. Harrison leaned back, exhaling sharply. So it's me and the baby then. It was less a question than a sentence. His schedule was a fortress built on precision, and this crack in the wall unsettled him more than he admitted. He closed the laptop, ending the call with Tokyo, and stood, straightening his cuffs with the practiced motion of a man who could not afford imperfection. Somewhere far below, in the same city, Marcus Johnson shifted uncomfortably in the backseat of a taxi that rattled with every pothole. His duffel bag sat on the floor, his travel chest set tucked safely in the front pocket, and he held his backpack close like it contained the sum total of his life. The cab smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap air freshener, the driver tapping impatiently on the steering wheel as traffic slowed to a crawl. Marcus checked his watch for the 5th time. Every red light was another reminder that he couldn't afford to miss this flight. London wasn't just a tournament, it was the thin thread of hope dangling over his family's future. The meter ticked upward. Each dollar another cut into the cash his mother had forced into his palm. He had promised to text her when he boarded, and the weight of that promise pressed heavier than his luggage. The driver grunted, "You cutting it close, kid?" Marcus forced a tight smile. "I'll make it." He had to. Back in the penthouse, Harrison walked through gleaming marble floors, Olivia squirming in his arms, fascinated with the platinum card he had handed her as a distraction. She gurgled, tugging at his tie with surprising strength. He looked at her, and for the briefest moment, the sharp edges of his expression softened. Catherine had insisted on family, and though Harrison never planned for it, here she was, small and insistent, a reminder that some things couldn't be controlled by contracts or quarterly earnings. The elevator doors slid open to the private garage, where a sleek town car waited. First class, United to Paris, Vivian reminded him as she handed over a folder of documents. Harrison nodded curtly, stepping into the car, his mind already leaping ahead to the meetings that would fill his days in Europe. In another corner of the city, Marcus's taxi finally pulled into the departure lane of O'Hare. He shoved crumpled bills at the driver, grabbed his bag, and bolted through the sliding doors, heart hammering. The contrast was stark. One man shielded by assistants, luxury vehicles, and a seamless itinerary, the other racing through crowded terminals with nothing but determination and a second-hand suit altered by his mother. Two men from different worlds, separated by wealth, by power, by the very fabric of their lives. And yet, without knowing it, they were moving toward the same gate, the same flight, the same collision course that would change them both forever. That was the irony hanging in the Chicago air, the billionaire and the boy, traveling parallel paths that no one believed could ever intersect, and yet fate had already set them on a direct line toward each other. Hours dragged on, and the cabin of the Boeing 787 felt less like a sanctuary of luxury and more like a pressure cooker ready to blow. Olivia's cries had become the rhythm of the flight, rising and falling in relentless waves that drowned out every other sound. Flight attendants rushed back and forth, their polished smiles long gone, replaced by tight lips and strained expressions. They tried everything: warm bottles, rattling toys, a pacifier dipped in sugar water, even a tiny dose of infant-safe drops offered by a doctor seated nearby. Nothing worked. Each attempt ended the same way, with Olivia arching her back, face crimson, fists clenched, and a howl that sliced through the recycled air with merciless precision. The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, finally sighed and shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at Harrison. "Sometimes babies just cry. It's developmentally normal." Harrison Reed had built empires on the premise that every problem had a solution. But here, with his daughter in his arms and 100 angry eyes burning holes in his back, he felt stripped of that certainty. He rocked her harder, whispered nonsense syllables, his suit wrinkled, tie hanging loose, sweat staining his collar. The helplessness gnawed at him like nothing he had ever faced in a boardroom. A businessman 3 rose up, snapped, "This is unbearable. Do something, or I'll file a complaint the second we land." A woman across the aisle muttered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "First class isn't what it used to be." The ripple of discontent spread quickly, passengers shifting, sighing, shooting dagger-like glares. The atmosphere was hostile. Every second another drop of fuel poured onto a fire already burning. Harrison finally broke. He stood in the aisle, Olivia wailing in his arms, his voice cracking as he shouted over the din. "I'll pay anyone who can get her to stop crying." The words hung in the air like a desperate bid at an auction no one wanted to attend. Heads turned away. People shifted uncomfortably. The image of a billionaire begging for help unsettled them more than the screaming infant itself. In economy, Marcus Johnson sat rigid in his narrow seat, the cries cutting through even his earbuds. He had tried to focus on his travel chess set, arranging pieces, reviewing openings. But the sound pierced his concentration. It wasn't just noise, it was memory. He saw himself at 10 years old, cradling his baby sister Zoe through nights when she wouldn't sleep, humming softly, finding the rhythm that only he seemed to possess. His mother used to call it the magic touch. He could almost feel the weight of Zoe in his arms again, the way she'd finally relax against him when no one else could reach her. Marcus clenched his fists. He knew what Olivia needed. He knew he could help. But between him and the chaos of first class was a thick blue curtain and all the invisible walls that curtain represented. Still, something inside him pushed him to act. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, his lanky frame unfolding into the aisle. The nearest flight attendant, already stressed from dealing with impatient passengers, wheeled the beverage cart into his path. "Sir, please remain seated. We're experiencing light turbulence." Marcus's voice was quiet but steady. "That baby's been crying for hours. I think I can help." Her eyes narrowed, scanning him from hoodie to worn jeans to skin color. Suspicion hardened her features. "First class is restricted, sir. Passengers only." Marcus felt the weight of that look press into him like it had so many times before. In stores where security guards trailed him. In classrooms where teachers blinked in surprise at his advanced placement scores. In tournaments where opponents underestimated him until the final move. Always the same verdict written in their eyes before he ever spoke. He took a breath, kept his voice even. "I understand, but sometimes the answer comes from unexpected places." She hesitated, torn between rules and the rising tension in the cabin. Before she could reply, the curtain whipped back. Harrison stood there, his immaculate image shattered, his voice breaking as he pleaded into the crowded silence. "Please, somebody, I'll pay anyone who can make her stop." The passengers looked away, unwilling to meet his desperation. All except Marcus. He stepped forward, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "Sir," he said softly, "I might be able to help your daughter." For a moment, Harrison's eyes flickered with something sharp, doubt, maybe even suspicion, as he took in the sight of the boy from economy, clothes worn, posture humble, skin dark. But desperation was stronger than pride, and 3 hours of helplessness had already brought him to his knees. The irony was brutal, hanging in the recycled air of the aircraft. The man who could hire an army of consultants, who had the world at his fingertips, was faced with the possibility that the only person capable of solving this problem was the one least likely to be trusted. The boy who had no seat in first class, no wealth, no status. The boy who carried nothing but memory, patience, and a rhythm learned in the quiet hours of his sister's cries. The curtain between worlds had been pulled back, and now every eye in first class was fixed on the boy who wasn't supposed to be there. Marcus stood frozen for half a breath, his palms slightly raised as though approaching a wild animal, every instinct telling him to retreat. But then Olivia's scream rose to a higher pitch, a sound so sharp it made heads flinch and shoulders hunch, and Marcus knew he had to step forward. Harrison looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, holding his daughter awkwardly, his expensive shirt stained, his composure shattered. "You have experience with babies?" he asked, his voice hoarse, stretched between skepticism and hope. Marcus nodded. "My little sister had colic. Sometimes the usual tricks don't work. May I?" He extended his arms. For a moment the billionaire hesitated, his grip tightening on the child as if the thought of surrendering her to a stranger, this stranger, was unthinkable. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, every passenger caught in the silent drama of a man weighing trust against despair. Finally, Harrison exhaled and placed Olivia into Marcus's arms. Time slowed. The boy adjusted her carefully, supporting her head with a practiced hand, cradling her small body against his chest. Her face was beet red, her cries shuddering through her entire frame. Marcus closed his eyes, let his muscles remember what his mind didn't have time to explain. He began to sway, not side to side, but in a subtle rocking rhythm, his whole body moving as if it were part of the hum building low in his chest. Not a lullaby, not a song, but a vibration, steady and patient, that resonated against her tiny ribs. His other hand traced small circles along her back, pressing gently at certain points between her shoulder blades. At first, nothing changed. The wail cut through the air like before, high and merciless. But then, almost imperceptibly, there was a hitch in her cry, a stutter, a pause. Marcus didn't open his eyes. He continued the hum, the rhythm, the circles, each motion deliberate, each breath synchronized with hers. 5 seconds stretched into eternity, the cabin caught in absolute silence except for the sound of a baby deciding whether or not to stop. And then it happened. Olivia's cries softened to hiccups, her tiny fists loosening, her chest relaxing against Marcus's shirt. The crimson faded from her face, her eyelids fluttered, and with one last shaky breath, she went quiet. The silence was deafening. For the first time in hours, there was no screaming, no wailing, just the hum of the engines and the faint sigh that rippled through the cabin as though the entire plane had exhaled at once. A collective release. Some passengers clapped softly, others simply closed their eyes in relief. The older woman who had been muttering under her breath covered her mouth in astonishment. The businessman who had complained earlier lowered his headphones and stared. The flight attendants had seen everything from medical emergencies to mid-air brawls, looked at Marcus as though witnessing something miraculous. Harrison stared frozen, his lips parting as if words had deserted him. His daughter, his impassible, inconsolable daughter, was sleeping against the chest of a boy in a worn hoodie. He reached out hesitantly, brushed a finger against her cheek, marveling at the calm. "How?" His voice broke, softer now. "How did you do that?" Marcus opened his eyes slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My sister was the same. Sometimes it's not about what they need. It's about how their body feels. The rhythm tells them it's safe." Harrison swallowed hard, studying the boy as though he was seeing him for the first time. Here was someone who had no degrees, no team of specialists, no staff to lean on, and yet, in the space of a minute, he had succeeded where all of Harrison's resources had failed. The irony wasn't lost on the other passengers either. Billionaire had offered money to anyone who could solve the problem, but the answer had come from the least likely place. A boy from economy, a boy no one had noticed until now. Marcus gently shifted Olivia in his arms, her tiny breath warm against his collarbone. He looked down at her with a tenderness that came not from training, but from lived experience, from nights spent rocking Zoe when their mother was too exhausted to move. He handed her back carefully, and Harrison accepted her as if she were made of glass. For the first time since takeoff, the powerful man's hands trembled not from frustration but from awe. The passengers watched, and in their eyes something had shifted too. The judgment that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a quiet recognition that what they had witnessed was more than luck. It was connection. It was a reminder that solutions don't always come from the places we expect. Harrison adjusted his hold on Olivia, his voice unsteady. "I offered to pay anyone, and yet here you are, doing what no one else could." Marcus shook his head, the faintest of smiles on his lips. "Some things you can't buy, sir, you just learn them." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. The cabin of the plane, once hostile, now felt lighter, warmer, as if a storm had passed. For the first time in hours, passengers leaned back in their seats, eyes closing, grateful. A moment ago they had been captives of chaos. Now, because of one unlikely boy, they were free. And though no one said it out loud, everyone in that cabin knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The leather seat of first class felt foreign under Marcus as he settled in beside Harrison, his backpack placed carefully at his feet. Olivia slept soundly in the bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling in the kind of peace no one had imagined possible just an hour earlier. The cabin was calmer now, passengers lost in their meals or books, but between the billionaire and the boy stretched a silence heavier than the ocean beneath them. Harrison finally broke it. "You handled her like you'd done it 1,000 times. His tone wasn't dismissive now, it carried curiosity, even respect. Marcus glanced at the baby, then back at Harrison. "My sister Zoe, she was colicky. Mom worked doubles, so most nights it was me pacing our apartment, humming, doing whatever it took to calm her down. You figure things out when you don't have a choice." Harrison studied him for a moment, his face unreadable, then nodded slowly. "Necessity. The best teacher." His gaze drifted back to Olivia, sleeping more soundly than she ever had on a flight. For a man used to controlling boardrooms, the idea that the solution had come from a 17-year-old with no credentials was both humbling and unsettling. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small magnetic chess set, the kind worn smooth by use. He set it carefully on the tray table, arranging the pieces with practiced precision. Harrison's eyes narrowed in recognition. "You play?" Marcus nodded. "International junior master. That's why I'm on this flight. Tournament in London. If I place high enough, it's a scholarship, maybe a way out." Harrison leaned back, intrigued. "Chess," he mused. "Never had the patience for it myself, too slow." Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's not about patience. It's about seeing patterns others miss. Every move has consequences, even the ones that seem small. Sometimes a single move changes the entire board." Harrison raised an eyebrow, recognizing the double meaning though Marcus hadn't said it aloud. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You think helping her was one of those moves? Marcus shrugged. Maybe, or maybe it was just the right thing to do. Harrison's laugh was soft, almost self-deprecating. I have a team of experts for everything. Pediatricians, consultants, specialists. None of them showed me what you just did in 5 minutes. Marcus's voice was steady. Some things you can't learn from experts. You learn them from living. Harrison reached into the bassinet, lifting Olivia carefully, trying to mimic the rhythm Marcus had used. His movements were awkward at first, too stiff, too deliberate. The baby stirred, her face tightening. Firm but gentle, Marcus coached, his voice low. Babies feel tension. If you're anxious, she will be too. Harrison adjusted, his jaw unclenching, his hands loosening their grip. Slowly, Olivia relaxed again, her tiny body melting into her father's chest. Harrison exhaled, a look of triumph flickering across his face like he had just closed a billion-dollar deal. Not bad for a beginner, Marcus said with a small grin. Harrison chuckled, the sound rare, genuine. Seems the teacher and the student have switched places. Marcus moved one of the chess pieces forward, tapping the board lightly. Happens more often than you think, on the board and off it. They began to play, Harrison cautious, Marcus deliberate but merciful. He explained strategies as they moved, pointing out traps, showing how each piece's power was connected to the whole. You're not playing to win, Harrison said after 20 minutes, his eyes narrowing. You're teaching. Marcus captured his bishop with a quiet click. Different goal, different strategy. Winning a game doesn't mean much if no one learns from it. Harrison leaned back, studying him not as a boy but as something more, an equal across a different kind of table. The silence between them no longer carried judgment but recognition. Marcus spoke again, softer now. My dad, he's been in prison since I was 11. Mom does everything, works double shifts, keeps us afloat. Every book, every tournament fee, it's a sacrifice. His voice wavered for the first time. That's why this tournament matters. It's not just about me, it's about her. Harrison didn't interrupt. He listened. And in that listening was something Marcus hadn't expected: respect. The billionaire who commanded thousands of employees, who rarely had to listen to anyone, sat silently absorbing the story of a boy from Southside Chicago. Harrison's gaze flicked to Olivia, her face pressed against his shirt. You're right, he said finally. Some moves don't just win games, they change everything. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man who built an empire was learning the most human lesson from a teenager who had nothing but experience, grit, and love for his family. The roles were reversed, and both of them knew it. The curtain between worlds hadn't just been pulled back anymore. It had been cut down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left separating the billionaire and the boy but a chessboard and the steady breath of a sleeping child. Paris greeted them with cool air and flashing cameras, though Harrison shielded Marcus from most of it, guiding him to the car that whisked him toward the Gare du Nord station. They parted ways there, the billionaire and the boy exchanging a firm handshake before Marcus boarded the train to London. By the time the Eurostar crossed into England, the rhythm of chess had already reclaimed his mind. The tournament hall in London buzzed with intensity. Players hunched over boards. Coaches whispered in corners, and the smell of tension was as sharp as the varnish on the polished tables. Marcus carried his small travel set like a talisman, his mother's voice still ringing in his head from their call the night before. Remember, you belong there. He took his seat across from his first opponent, a Russian prodigy whose reputation preceded him, and let his focus sharpen. Move by move, hour by hour, he advanced. His patience outlasted aggression. His memory dismantled arrogance. He clawed his way through the bracket until only one match remained. The final game was grueling, 5 hours under hot lights, cameras clicking with every turn of the board. His opponent pressed hard, but Marcus waited, calm as a still lake, until the moment came. A knight's sacrifice, unexpected and brilliant, shattered the opponent's defense. The hall erupted when the handshake came, applause crashing like a wave as Marcus rose with victory in hand. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile, not wide, but steady, the smile of someone who had carried the weight of a family and set it down on a table of 64 squares. That night, in the quiet of his modest hotel room, his phone buzzed. A message from Harrison. Congratulations, champion. Olivia says thank you, and another request, meet us in Paris tomorrow. Marcus returned to France with the weight of his trophy in his bag and something heavier in his chest. In the lounge of the George V, Harrison and Catherine were waiting, Olivia babbling happily on her mother's lap. Harrison rose, his tone softer than Marcus had ever heard it. I want to offer you a place in the Reed Foundation. Full support through college, mentorship, opportunities beyond chess. You have something rare, Marcus, and I don't mean just talent, I mean resilience, emotional intelligence, the kind of wisdom we need more of. Marcus listened, his jaw tightening. He thought of Zoe's face pressed to the window, of his mother's exhausted eyes. Thought of the boy he was in economy class, invisible to the world until a baby's cry forced him into the light. His voice was quiet, but every word was steady. If this is charity, I can't accept it. I don't want to be your good deed, sir. I want to be recognized for what I've earned. Harrison's brow furrowed, then softened. It isn't charity, it's recognition. What you showed me on that plane was worth more than money. It was perspective. And you taught me, a man like me. Learning from you, that's no handout. Marcus studied him, weighing the sincerity in his eyes, the sincerity in Catherine's nod as she cradled Olivia. Slowly, Marcus exhaled. Then I'll accept, but only on those terms, not as a favor, not as a story you tell at parties, as acknowledgement that I belong at the table. Harrison extended his hand, and this time the shake was not billionaire to boy, but equal to equal. Later, walking alone through the Paris streets, Marcus felt the city's hum vibrate beneath his feet. The Foundation's offer had opened a door, but the victory on the chessboard had already proven he could walk through on his own. His phone buzzed again. A message from Harrison. Sometimes a single move changes the whole board. You made one of those moves. Marcus stopped, staring at the words until they blurred. He remembered standing in the aisle of the plane, ignored, doubted, judged. He remembered the silence when Olivia finally quieted, the collective exhale of strangers. That was the moment the board had shifted, not just for him, but for Harrison too. On a flight between continents, a boy from Southside Chicago had reached across a divide no one thought could be bridged, and in doing so, altered the trajectory of two lives. In chess, they called it a decisive move, one that reshaped the game forever. In life, it was the same. Sometimes the most powerful act is not the grand gesture, but the quiet step forward when no one else will move. And as Marcus lifted his eyes to the Paris night, he knew he had already made that move. A move that changed the entire board. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.